When my parents divorced, my mother and I moved into my grandparents' house in a small, isolated village in Vermont. Our new home was an old, modest cottage next to my grandparents' main house. I thought it would be a temporary change, but I was about to enter an endless nightmare. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence you expect in the countryside. It was an oppressive silence, almost as if the house itself were holding its breath. At night, this silence turned into something more sinister. The wind howled through the trees, making the old windows shake and the wooden beams groan, as if protesting our presence. The first few nights in the new house were, to say the least, unsettling. The silence that felt strange during the day became oppressive at night, enveloping me like a suffocating blanket. Every sound, every creak of the old house, seemed amplified in the darkness. On the third night, I woke up suddenly to a strange sound. It was a soft, almost rhythmic knocking coming from my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was my imagination, perhaps a dream. But the sound continued, steady and insistent. My heart started to beat faster, and a cold sensation ran down my spine. I called out for my mother, but there was no response. The knocking persisted, and I felt an increasing urgency to find out what was causing the noise. Finally, gathering all my courage, I got out of bed and walked to the door. I opened it slowly, the wood creaking under my trembling hands. The hallway was empty. Only darkness stared back at me. The sound had stopped the moment I opened the door, leaving only the terrifying silence. I looked around, hoping to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The house was still, as if it were watching me, waiting for my reaction. I carefully closed the door and went back to bed, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe it was just the old house full of nighttime noises, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I lay there, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to every little sound, every creak of the wood. That night, I took a long time to fall asleep, my heart still racing. The sense that something was not right stayed with me, an invisible presence that seemed to lurk in the dark corners of my room. And as I tried to sleep, one question wouldn't leave me alone. What was really causing those sounds? The nights at my grandparents' house began to turn into an ordeal. Each night seemed longer, filled with inexplicable noises and strange sensations. But the worst of it all started with the nightmares. At first, they were just vague dreams, but soon they turned into something much more terrible. One night, I had a dream so vivid it felt real. I was standing in the middle of the house's hallway, wrapped in suffocating gloom. Suddenly, I saw a man in the distance. He stood still, with his back hunched and his face turned toward me. His face was black as night, with no visible features, just an empty darkness where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The sense of terror was paralyzing. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. I wanted to run, but my legs were glued to the floor. He didn't move, just watched me with those empty eyes that seemed to suck all the light around them. I woke up gasping, covered in cold sweat. The room was dark and silent, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I looked around, but there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but the deep sense of fear didn't leave me. The next night, the dream returned, and this time he was closer. Again, I was in the hallway, and the man with the black face was there, immobile, staring at me. This time, he raised a bony hand and pointed at me. I woke up with a scream stuck in my throat, my heart pounding wildly. From that moment on, the dreams became constant. Every night, the man with the black face appeared, always closer, always more threatening. I was starting to dread sleeping, fearing what he would do when he finally reached me. It felt as if my sanity was slipping away, eroded by fear and despair. Each day dragged on, marked by the terrifying anticipation of the approaching night. And as the sun set, the house seemed to plunge into even deeper darkness, as if it were waiting for the return of the man with the black face. I knew I needed to do something, to tell someone what was happening. but part of me feared that no one would believe me, that they would think I was going crazy. And maybe I was. After all, how could I explain that man with a black face who haunted me every night? One cold Friday night, I was in the living room trying to distract myself with a book. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the dim light of the old lamp. Everything was silent, a heavy silence that seemed to compress the air around me. As I read, I heard a distinct sound, a light scratching, like wood being dragged across the floor. My eyes slowly lifted from the book, scanning the room for the source of the sound. Then I saw it. The rocking chair in the corner of the room was moving, slowly, back and forth, with a disturbing rhythm. My heart began to beat faster. The chair was about 10 feet from me, but I could clearly see the movement, as if someone invisible were rocking it. I tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe a draft? But all the windows were closed, and the door was locked. I stood up, hesitant. Each step I took seemed to echo in the silence of the room. As I approached the chair, it suddenly stopped, as if it knew it was being watched. A shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment, fear paralyzed me. I looked around, expecting to see something or someone, but the room was empty. Just me and that rocking chair. I touched it with my fingertips, and the cold would seem to cut into my skin. Nothing else moved. It was as if the house were testing me, playing with my nerves. I returned to the sofa, trying to resume reading, but my concentration was gone. My gaze kept drifting back to the chair, waiting for it to move again. Fear was a constant weight on my chest, a sense that something was very wrong in that house. That night, I went to bed with my mind full of unanswered questions and a growing fear. I closed my eyes, but the image of the moving chair wouldn't leave me alone. And deep down, a part of me knew that this was only the beginning, that the horrors the house hid were yet to come. I woke up several times during the night, sweating cold, with the feeling that something was in my room, watching. But every time I turned on the light, there was nothing. Just the same oppressive darkness, the same unsettling silence. And in the silence, I could almost hear the rocking chair moving, like a sinister reminder that the house had its secrets, and they were far from being revealed. After several sleepless nights and constantly feeling watched, I decided I needed to talk to someone. My grandmother had always been a calm and understanding person, and I hoped she could give me some explanation or at least some comfort. I found her in the kitchen, making tea as she did every afternoon. I sat at the table and waited for her to join me, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. I took a deep breath and began to recount everything that had happened since we moved. I told her about the knocking on the door, the nightmares with the man with the black face, and the chair that moved on its own. As I spoke, my grandmother's expression changed. Her eyes, usually full of life and wisdom, grew dark and serious. When I finished, she was silent for a moment, looking at the tea as if searching for the right words. Finally, she began to speak. Her voice was low and trembling, something I had never heard before. "Michael," she said, "there's something you need to know about this house." She told me that many years ago, 2 men had died here. They were workers renovating the house, and both died under mysterious circumstances, their faces contorted in expressions of pure terror. My grandmother looked into my eyes, and I could see the fear reflected in hers. We never found an explanation for what happened. After that, stories began about the house being haunted. Many people reported strange phenomena, but no one wanted to talk much about it. It was as if mentioning the events gave more power to whatever is here. I felt a knot form in my stomach. My grandmother's words brought a new level of fear to everything I was experiencing. Before I could ask more, a loud noise interrupted the conversation. It was a thud from upstairs, as if something heavy had fallen. My grandmother and I looked at each other, terror etched on our faces. Without saying a word, she got up and grabbed a candle and a match, lighting the small flame to illuminate our way. We climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under our feet. The hallway was cold and gloomy, and the flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls. When we reached the top of the stairs, we saw the guest bedroom door open. Inside, the furniture was overturned, as if an invisible force had swept through, scattering everything. My grandmother squeezed my hand, and I could feel her tremble. "We need to leave here," she whispered, her voice full of urgency. "This house is not safe. It never was." We hurried down the stairs, hearts pounding wildly. As we ran to the safety of my grandparents' main house, I could feel something watching us, an invisible presence that seemed to delight in our fear. That night, as we tried to sleep in my grandparents' main house, the silence felt even more oppressive. And I knew that even though we were out of that small house next door, the horrors it contained would not leave us in peace so easily. In the early morning, I woke up suddenly, not knowing exactly what had awakened me. The room was dark, except for the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains. I sat up in bed, trying to understand what was wrong. Then I heard the footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps coming from the stairs. My heart raced. I knew everyone was asleep in the main house. Who, or what, could be moving around on the stairs? I got up slowly, trying not to make a sound, and walked to the bedroom door. With each step, the sounds became clearer. They were firm, rhythmic steps, as if someone were climbing the stairs with a sinister purpose. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peek down the hallway. The hallway was shrouded in shadows, but the moonlight created a faint outline of things. And then I saw it. A dark, indistinct figure stood in the middle of the stairs. The shape was human, but it seemed made of shadows, a living, pulsating darkness. I was paralyzed, unable to look away. The figure started to climb again, and with each step, I felt a cold chill spread through my body. I tried to back away, but my feet seemed glued to the floor. Everything inside me screamed to run, but fear held me there, trapped. When the figure reached the top of the stairs, it stopped again, as if it knew I was watching. Suddenly, the darkness around it began to move, extending down the hallway, coming toward me. I managed to regain control of my muscles and slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. I ran back to bed, curling up under the blankets like a child, hoping it would be enough to protect me. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the footsteps. Every second seemed to drag on, and I wondered if the figure was on the other side of the door, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed there, motionless, my heart racing uncontrollably. But eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I fell asleep, tormented by nightmares of shadows and footsteps. When the sun finally rose, it brought a sense of relief, but also a new, grim reality. I knew that what I had seen was not my imagination. The house was alive with something ancient and malevolent, something that delighted in spreading fear. I told my mother, but she seemed reluctant to believe, or perhaps she didn't want to admit the truth. The house, which during the day seemed just old and worn, at night turned into a place of terror. And I knew that, somehow, I needed to find out what that presence wanted, why it was tormenting us. But with every step I took, every answer I sought, the fear grew, and the darkness seemed to close in around us even more. It was an especially cold night, and the house seemed quieter than usual. I was in bed, trying to read to distract my mind, but the feeling of being watched was intense. With each page turned, my eyes would drift to the darkness of the room, expecting to see something move. Around midnight, I turned off the light and tried to sleep. That's when I heard it for the first time. A whispering voice, so low it seemed to come from inside my own head. It was saying my name, Michael, in a drawn-out, melancholic way. The sound seemed to come from all sides, enveloping me, as if the walls themselves were whispering to me. A chill ran down my spine, and my hairs stood on end. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me due to exhaustion and fear. But the voice continued, becoming clearer and more insistent. Michael, come. It was an inhuman voice, cold and full of malice. I covered my head with a pillow, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The voice seemed to penetrate everything, as if it were directly in my mind. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, I sat up in bed and looked around the dark room. "Who's there?" My voice sounded weak and trembling. The response was a deep silence, as if the house itself were waiting, listening. I took a deep breath and decided to leave the room. Maybe if I went to the living room, the sound would stop. I walked down the hallway, my steps echoing in the silence. The house seemed colder than usual, and every shadow seemed to move as I passed. When I reached the living room, the whispering started again, louder this time. "Michael, I'm here." It was as if the voice were inside the room with me. I turned quickly, trying to locate the source, but there was no one there. The sense of terror was overwhelming. I felt like a puppet, pulled by the strings of fear. My hands trembled, and my heart pounded uncontrollably. I thought about running outside, but something stopped me. Perhaps it was the irrational hope that it was all just a dream, or the fear of encountering something even worse outside. Then the voice changed. "Help me," it said, now sounding almost desperate. It was as if, beyond the malice, there was a hint of suffering. This change paralyzed me. Whatever it was, it seemed trapped, seeking help, but it was also something deeply malevolent. I knew I couldn't stay there. I ran back to the bedroom and slammed the door shut, locking it. I curled up in bed, trying to control my breathing. The whispering continued for a few more minutes, then abruptly stopped, leaving a silence so deep that my ears buzzed. That night, sleep was impossible. I stayed awake until dawn, my heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. The voice in the dark wasn't a hallucination. It was real, and it knew my name. And the sense that it was far from over was overwhelming. The next day, I told my mother and grandmother about the voice. They listened in silence, but I could see the concern in their eyes. We were all trapped in that cursed house, and each night, the horrors seemed to increase. I knew I needed to understand what was happening, but whatever it was beyond my comprehension, and the only thing I could do was wait for the next night, dreading what it would bring. It was a gray and cloudy morning when I woke up, feeling the same familiar weight of fear and anxiety that had become my constant companion. I decided I needed to get out of the room, try to push away the dark thoughts haunting me. I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, hoping to find some comfort in breakfast with my mother and grandmother. When I opened the bedroom door, I was greeted by a sight that made my blood run cold. There were wet footprints in the hallway, as if someone had walked with soaked feet through the house. The marks started at the front door and led to my bedroom before disappearing mysteriously. My heart began to beat faster, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. The footprints were clear and distinct, every detail of a bare foot marked on the wooden floor. Who could have left these footprints? The house had been locked during the night, and no one else could have entered. I called out to my mother and grandmother, my voice trembling with rising panic. They came running, and the shock on their faces only heightened my fear. My mother tried to find a logical explanation, but there was none. The air in the house seemed heavier, laden with an invisible tension. We decided to follow the footprints, moving slowly down the hallway. Every step we took seemed to echo in the oppressive silence of the house. The footprints led us to the front door, which was locked and with the security chain in place. There were no signs of forced entry or any indication that someone had entered or left. My grandmother, with a trembling voice, suggested we clean up the footprints and try to forget the incident. But I knew that would be impossible. Something was haunting us, and it wasn't just the house itself. There was a presence, something ancient and malevolent, that seemed to toy with our fears. As we cleaned up the footprints, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow in the corner of my eye seemed to move, every little noise made me jump. The house, which during the day seemed just old and worn, at night turned into a place of terror. That night, I went to bed early, trying to push away the dark thoughts tormenting me. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, listening to every sound, every creak of the wood, waiting for something terrible to happen. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, closer. I knew they were coming toward my bedroom. I shut my eyes tight, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sound continued, growing louder. Suddenly, everything went silent. I opened my eyes and saw, in the gap of my bedroom door, a shadow, a dark, indistinct figure standing there, watching me. Fear paralyzed me, and for a moment, I couldn't move. But then the figure started to approach, slowly, step by step. In a desperate act, I jumped out of bed and turned on the light. The figure vanished instantly, leaving only the void and the oppressive silence. My heart pounded uncontrollably, and I knew that presence wouldn't leave so easily. I was about to fall into a restless sleep when I felt a strange pressure on my chest. It was as if something heavy were sitting on me, making it hard to breathe. I opened my eyes and, in the faint moonlight coming through the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man with the black face was sitting at the edge of my bed. His empty eyes were pits of infinite darkness, and his face, a mask of terror without defined features. He didn't move, just stared at me, as if waiting for some reaction from me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my body was paralyzed with fear. For a moment that seemed to last an eternity, I lay there, immobile, staring at that being. The darkness around him seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. Then he began to move. Slowly, he stood up from the bed and started to walk toward me. Every step he took seemed to resonate in my soul, filling me with an indescribable terror. I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't respond. He stopped beside my bed and leaned over me, his black eyes fixed on mine. I felt the air around me turn icy, and a smell of mold and decay filled my nostrils. It was as if death itself were there, watching me. "Michael." The voice that came from his mouth was a cold whisper, full of malice and suffering. "You cannot escape me." With tremendous effort, I finally managed to move. I rolled out of bed and turned on the bedside lamp. The figure vanished instantly, leaving only the void and the silence. I stood there, panting, trying to calm my racing heart. I woke my mother and grandmother and told them what had happened. They looked at me with expressions of horror and concern. We knew it wasn't a dream, that the man with the black face was real and becoming more daring. That morning, as the sun rose, my grandmother suggested we consult the local priest. Perhaps he could bless the house and help us rid ourselves of that malevolent presence. We agreed. Anything was better than continuing to live in that nightmare. The priest arrived that afternoon, bringing with him a bottle of holy water and an old crucifix. He walked through the house, reciting prayers and sprinkling holy water in every corner. As he did this, I felt a lightness in the air, as if the oppression were loosening. But deep down, I knew it was only a temporary measure. The man with the black face would not go away so easily. He was part of that house, part of something much older and more malevolent, and I feared that, no matter what we did, we would never be truly free of him. That night, we slept in my grandparents' main house again. The silence was once again oppressive, but I was so exhausted that I eventually fell asleep. And for the first time in weeks, I had no nightmares. But the relief was short-lived. I knew the battle was far from over, and that the man with the black face was just waiting for his next opportunity to terrorize us. The feeling of being watched never left me, and every shadow seemed to hide dark secrets. We were trapped in a cycle of fear and despair, and I didn't know how much longer we could hold on. After the encounter with the man with the black face, my mother and I decided we needed to leave that house no matter what. It didn't matter where we went, as long as it was far from there. We spent the next few days packing our things, trying not to think about the horrors that had happened. But the house wouldn't let us go so easily. On the last night before our departure, I woke up again with the sensation of a weight on me. The room was immersed in a darkness so dense it felt tangible. The air was icy, and a smell of decay filled the room. I knew he was there, the man with the black face. I tried to get up, but my body was paralyzed with fear. Then I heard that icy voice again. Michael. The voice sounded like a whisper from the depths of hell. You cannot escape. With superhuman effort, I managed to move and turned on the light. The figure disappeared, but the fear remained, rooting itself deeper within me. I knew I needed to leave immediately. I ran downstairs and found my mother in the kitchen, already awake and trembling. We need to go now, I said, my voice full of urgency. She agreed, and we began gathering our last things frantically. As we loaded the bags into the car, I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly and saw a shadow in the corner of the room, a shadow that seemed to pulse with malice. Go, I shouted to my mother, who ran to the car. I followed close behind, my steps echoing in the oppressive silence of the house. We got into the car, and my mother started the engine, speeding away with desperate haste. As we drove away from the house, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing on the porch, watching me. His black eyes were pits of infinite darkness, and I knew he wasn't finished with us. When we arrived at my grandparents' house, we quickly entered and locked all the doors and windows. My grandmother awaited us, her face a mask of worry and fear. We told her what had happened, and she hugged us, trying to comfort us. That night, we all slept in the living room, with all the lights on. The silence was deep, but different from the oppressive silence of the other house. It was a silence of relief, of hope that perhaps we had escaped the worst. The next morning, I woke up with sunlight streaming through the windows. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. We decided we would never return to that house. My grandmother called a real estate agent to sell it as quickly as possible. Days passed, and the feeling of safety slowly began to return. But sometimes at night, I still felt a presence, as if I were being watched. I knew the man with the black face had not disappeared completely. He was there, in the shadows, waiting. A few months later, I received a call from the real estate agent. He said the house had been sold, but something strange had happened. The new owners reported strange phenomena almost immediately after moving in. Inexplicable sounds, moving shadows, and the feeling of being watched. My heart froze. I knew the house was marked by something evil, something that couldn't be easily banished. And even though we were far away, the sense that the man with the black face might one day find me again never left. Whatever that presence was, I knew my family and I were not the only ones affected, and that the cycle of fear and terror would continue, claiming more victims over time. We knew that, somehow, we would need to find a way to deal with it, to protect each other. In the meantime, we lived our lives, trying to regain normalcy. But the memory of that house, of the horrors we faced, never left us completely. And every shadow, every sound in the silence of the night, brought with it a dark reminder that the evil was still there, in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity.